Hello and welcome to today's lesson on nuclear fusion, which is part of the atomic structure topic in GCSE Separate Science physics. So in today's lesson we're going to look at understanding the process of nuclear fusion. So if we've been successful and learnt in today's lesson, we should be able to describe what nuclear fusion is, describe how energy is released in a fusion reaction, and understand the conditions needed for nuclear fusion to occur, which is part of the GCSE Separate Science topic atomic structure in 4.4.4.2 nuclear fusion, which is a separate science only part of the content. So as well as unstable nuclei being able to become more stable by carrying out nuclear decay, they can also carry out two other processes. Now the first process that we looked was the idea of an unstable nucleus splitting into two more stable nuclei, which is nuclear fission. But in today's lesson we're going to look at the other process which increases nuclear stability, nuclear fusion. So nuclear fusion takes place when two nuclei combine to form a bigger nucleus. So you start off with lighter individual nuclei which are unstable, they will come together and they'll form a heavier individual nucleus which is more stable. Now it's important to note that when fusion takes place, the total mass before fusion is higher than the total mass after fusion. This means that some of the mass from the start of the process has been lost when fusion has been carried out. Now, like fission, this mass has been converted into energy, and we can calculate the amount of energy produced with the equation E equals mc squared. So the change in mass times by the speed of light squared gives you how much energy is released in the fusion process. Now this is the same equation used to work out the energy released in nuclear fission. So it's important to note that the nucleus produced in fusion exists in a lower energy state than the two nuclei at the start. So this excess energy is shed by the nucleus and given out in the process, because remember, nuclear fusion is increasing nuclear stability, so as a result afterwards the nuclei need less energy to exist. Now this energy released is released as the kinetic energy store of the product. Now it's important to note that nuclear fusion does not happen at room temperature and at room pressure. For fusion to occur in the universe, the temperature and pressure must be extremely high, because the fusion process can only take place if the two nuclei being combined are travelling at a very high speed. The reason for this is due to their charge. Both of these particular particles are nuclei, so this means they both have a positive charge, because all nuclei are positively charged. So because they're both positively charged, they will repel each other. So we need to have both nuclei having a high speed to overcome this electrostatic repulsion of the two positive nuclei, so they can combine together to form one large nucleus. Now every element below iron will fuse together, as this increases nuclear stability. Now remember what we said previously, iron is the most stable nucleus in the universe. It does not need to carry out nuclear fusion. Now the sun is in the main sequence of its life cycle. Now all stars are actually carrying out nuclear fusion, and we can define the parts of the life a star undergoes by its fusion of different elements. So because the sun is in its main sequence of its life cycle, it means it's fusing hydrogen nuclei together to form helium. So nuclear fusion is the joining of two light nuclei to form a heavier nucleus. Now in this process, some of the mass may be converted into the energy of radiation. Now every element below iron can carry out fusion. Main sequence stars like our sun fuse hydrogen nuclei into helium. So like we said before, for nuclear fusion to occur, a high temperature and pressure is needed to overcome the repulsion between the nuclei, and the most common place where this occurs in the universe is stars. Now we define a star as a stellar object which undergoes nuclear fusion. Now it's important to note that we define the parts of life a star undergoes is by the fusion of elements it's carrying out. So we can look at the particular different types of stars in our universe by the different nuclear fusion of elements they are carrying out. Now it's important to note that the sun has been producing energy by nuclear fusion in its core through a series of steps called the proton-proton chain. Now the Sun is actually quite a small star, which is in its main sequence process. Now the core is the only region in the Sun that carries out nuclear fusion and produces thermal energy. Now 99% of the Sun's power is generated within 24% of the Sun's radius, and by 30% of the Sun's radius the fusion is stopped completely, so it's only happening in the centre of the Sun. Now, fusing hydrogen nuclei into a helium nucleus releases about 0.7% of the mass as energy. Now, the Sun releases energy at a mass conversion rate of about 4.26 million metric tons per second, for 3.8 times 10 to the 26 watts of power, or 9.192 times 10 to the 10 megatons of TNT being detonated every second. So let's look at the process of fusion in the Sun. Let's consider the smallest element in the universe, hydrogen. Now the Sun is not special. All stars like the Sun carry out this fusion process, which we call in stars the pp chain. Now it's important to note that technically the hydrogen nuclei is stripped of its electron. It's a plasma. Now actually plasma is the most common state of matter in the universe, so at this point the hydrogen nucleus is basically just a proton, which is where the name proton-proton chain comes from. Now let's consider two hydrogen nuclei. Now in reality there's billions and billions of hydrogen nuclei in the Sun. Now at the start of its cycle, stars like the Sun are comprised of approximately 98% of hydrogen nuclei, and this hydrogen was originally produced at the Big Bang. Now what happens is the hydrogen nuclei are pushed together under the high pressure of the core of the Sun. Now the higher pressure is caused by the other nuclei pushing down on them due to gravity. Now again, this process only happens in the core of the Sun, as it's the only place where the pressure is high enough. So the two hydrogen nuclei fuse together and form a helium nucleus. Now the helium is formed as it's still in a plasma state, as there's no electrons being added. Now it's important to note that when this takes place, some of the mass of the two hydrogens turns into energy. Now more mass turns into energy here per kilogram than it does in fission. Now actually nuclear fusion is the process which produces the most energy per kilogram possible in the universe. Now interestingly, this energy released takes about 170,000 years to travel from the Sun's core, where it's produced, to the surface of the Sun to be emitted. Now the steps to make deuterium and tritium in the Sun's core occur first, which is actually why it's actually called a three-chain event, because actually one of the hydrogen nuclei is deuterium, which is when you've got an extra neutron present with a proton, and the other hydrogen nuclei present is tritium, which is when you've got two neutrons present with a proton. Now in stars, the fusion process can continue until the nucleus formed is iron. Now all stars in theory can fuse to form the most stable nucleus, iron, but this can only truly happen in really big stars. Now in smaller stars like our Sun, they can only fuse to about carbon. Beyond this point, the repulsion between the nuclei just gets too large. So we can look at a simplified process of this fusion. So what's taken place is the two come together here, fusion occurs, and you're producing helium afterwards. Now we can actually model the ideas of nuclear fusion on using bubbles. So it's like when two bubbles hit together, they join together to form one large bubble or one large nucleus, and this is what's going on in nuclear fusion. So we can state that fusion is two small nuclei joining together to form one large nucleus. It releases the most energy per kilogram possible in the universe. It occurs naturally in stars, and the reactants are hydrogen and the product is helium. Now by contrast, fission is when one large nucleus splits to form two smaller nuclei. A lot of energy is produced per kilogram, but not as much as fusion. It occurs in power stations, and its reactant is uranium, and its products are barium and krypton. So let's just look at the comparison between the two. So you can just look at the differences between the two fission and fusion processes. Now, it's important to note that whilst we understand the process of nuclear fusion, we've tried to replicate this on Earth to produce energy for electricity. Now, it's important to note that this will release energy as kinetic energy. Now, the reactants of nuclear fusion are easily found in water, because hydrogen is found in the hydrogen oxide of the water, and there's enough energy in a teaspoon of water to power the entire Earth by fusion for a year. So you can actually find this hydrogen hydrogen we need for fusion in the actual water of the Earth. Now the product of fusion is helium, which is a harmless gas. It's not pollutant, it doesn't cause climate change. We even make helium today as there's not enough for commercial demand. So as a result, let's just recap. The reactants of fusion are easily found in water. Now there's enough energy in a teaspoon of water to power the entire Earth by fusion for a year. The product of fusion is helium, which is a harmless gas. It's non-pollutant, and we even make helium today as there's not enough for commercial demand. And this nuclear fusion process does not take up a huge amount of space, and we know how it works in great detail. Now, why can't we carry out this process on Earth today, especially as generating electricity is a major talking point for the world currently? Now, let's just once again look at this idea. The reactants are found in seawater. The products produced are harmless and it releases the most energy per kilogram of any process. But we can't carry this out commercially because, like we said before, the charges are both positive for our reactor nuclei, so they repel each other. So to overcome this repulsion between the reactor nuclei, the nuclei need to be forced together at a high speed. Now this does not happen in conditions found on the Earth naturally. So to push the hydrogen nuclei together and fuse, a very high pressure is needed as it forces the nuclei together. So we need for fusion to occur on Earth a high temperature and a high pressure. Now again, the higher the temperature, the more energy the nuclei have at overcoming the repulsion. Now that would actually push the particles together as well if you've got a high pressure. So the conditions needed for fusion on Earth are a high temperature and a high pressure. Now it's very expensive to actually carry these conditions out and replicate them on Earth, and it's also very difficult to achieve for more than just a few seconds. So it's important to note that we would carry out nuclear fusion on Earth, but if it wasn't for the conditions, because you need a high temperature and a high pressure. So it means that nuclei which are fused are difficult to contain. So today, many fission reactors that we have on Earth can only work for a few minutes before the temperature decreases too much and the fusion process stops. And secondly, many fusion reactors currently need more energy to carry out the process than the energy released in the process. So as a result, it's commercially unviable. So nuclear fusion is the joining of two light nuclei to form a heavier nucleus, and in this process some of the mass may be converted into the energy of radiation. So if we've been successful and learnt in today's lesson, we can describe what nuclear fusion is, we can describe how energy is released in a fusion reaction, and we can understand the conditions needed for nuclear fusion to occur. So I hope you've enjoyed today's lesson on nuclear fusion, which is part of the atomic structure topic in GCSE Separate Science Physics. Thank you very much for listening to this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and have a lovely day.